Hello, everybody. Welcome to DC Time. I'm Dean.
I'm Chris.
Thanks for joining us again. We are going to go over this is number 5 of the 7 sayings by Jesus Christ when he was on the cross. And today we're looking at, and this is in 3 different places, right? It's in Matthew 27, Mark 15, and Luke 23.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and read from Luke 23:46. And shouting with a loud voice, Jesus said, Father, into thy hands am I committing my spirit. Now saying this, he expires. Going back to last show, we talked about the thief on the cross, recognizing that this was the Messiah.
And he knew something about a kingdom.
Yeah, and he said, remember me. And we talked about in the scripture, the way we used to look at that in the past, how just kind of looked at that as when they died, and when he died, he was going to get to go to heaven. He was going to go to paradise. And if you remember, if you didn't watch, we pointed out that the comma, if you put the comma in
a certain place.
Yeah, more to where it looks like a lot of the scholars have done from a literal standpoint, try to get it as accurate as possible in context. It seems to provide evidence that Jesus is saying, hey, I'm telling you something today. You're okay.
Yeah.
You know, you're going to be okay. You're going to be with me in paradise. Didn't mean they're going to be there in 5 minutes.
Right. In that calendar day.
And so, but if we do look at it, I want to say the common thinking is, okay, we die and we go somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that happens, then that's what we're looking at today. What does Jesus say? What happened to him?
Yeah.
And we'll read it again.
What does Scripture say about this?
Yeah.
Too?
Scriptures here, Luke 23, Jesus says, Father, into thy hands I am committing my spirit. So his spirit goes back to God, back to his Father. Where does his body go? We know that his body's still there. They take it to the tomb. And then what happens? 3 days later,
the tomb's empty.
He's resurrected. So it appears to us, just based on this here too, did Jesus and the thief go together to paradise somewhere? Doesn't seem like that at all. So we just want to point that out again, and something to think about. And then, of course, there's so much in here, because you get into then what is the spirit, what is the human spirit, what happens at death. Chris mentioned this last week, something we'll probably get into, talking about what does happen at death. What do we believe about death? So we're going to just talk about some of those things. And I may read some things from Enoch and others about what is the spirit, some of their thoughts on that.
Yeah. First thing I want to say was this has been a great week for me this past week. I wanted to say this real quick. Our daughter Emily, our youngest daughter, gave us 2 little babies on October 6th, Eleanor and Oliver. And this week, Beth and I have been helping them with night feedings, and we've been having a ball, and it's been fantastic. And I shared some of this with the WhatsApp, the people on the WhatsApp, Pursuing Love, and we are having a blast. And I want to thank everybody for the well-wishing and the prayers and all that stuff. Very much happy about and pleased with, and thank you for that. I want to quickly get that in there. Talking about these 3 verses, gives out his spirit. I got /expires. It's interesting because one of the very last show that we intend to do on this, or at least on the 7 sayings that Christ says, will be the last one on these sayings, is it is accomplished, and that's in John. So here we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke talking about him expiring, giving up his spirit, and there's reference to that in John 19:30, where reclining his head, he says, it is accomplished, and then expires. We didn't put that one here because In that specific verse, Jesus says the words, "It is accomplished." So he put it by itself. That's why it becomes the seventh thing Jesus said while on the cross. But these verses are connected just like last week's verses are connected. And what Dean was just pointing out with the thief on the cross, and where did they go, and where is paradise? I gave you some definitions of what our religious institutions think that paradise is, and they're all over the place. A realm in between heaven and earth. Some call it heaven. It's just heaven. It's lumped into the basket of God's heaven. We do that all the time. A lot of us do that with soul and spirit. Soul and spirit are spoke. You speak about them as being the same thing.
Yeah, that's something right there. That's big to consider if you haven't, if you're new to any of that, or that's a new thought.
Hey, that's how I thought.
Yeah,
for a long time.
Explore that, and be open to the fact that maybe there's something different going on there.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe.
It is.
That's a
big subject.
Yeah, I interchange spirit and soul.
I did all the time
too, and I don't see that anymore now. We're looking in a grand sense of it now. The soul, we become aware. God's spirit comes in, makes us aware.
Yeah.
And so that's the sense, the senses, the soul. We become aware.
Yeah.
So it is something good to think about what's going to happen, and just like what happened here with Jesus and what he said at his death, what happened there, and to consider that. To consider, I remember the first time that I realized, reading and studying about the spirit and soul, and then realizing that, wow, Jesus himself, the thought that Jesus himself, unless the Father, which has his spirit, and unless that's returned back to Jesus, back to his body, where would Jesus be?
Right.
Those are big thoughts there. That gets into what the belief about death and what's really happened at death.
Early on, I didn't divide those things.
Yeah.
I just saw it as a whole entity. The body, and like I just said, soul and spirit to me were the same thing. I never questioned why Scripture would sometimes talk about a soul and sometimes Scripture would talk about a spirit. I just lumped it all together like they do with paradise and heaven, And Father has opened my eye. I believe Father's opened my eyes to some differences here, One of the things I did do on these verses, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I think you've got the other one that I have. Okay. I don't remember which one.
Yeah, which one you want to do?
Well, it looks like this. It's the third one of these. Is it under here? Or there it is right there.
Okay.
These were A. Enoch's commentary on these three verses that we brought up. And there's some interesting things shared here. And then there's things I'm like, I don't know what to do with exactly what he's saying. Yeah. Okay, so, and I'm okay with that. Let's go right to Matthew 27:50. Now Jesus again crying with a loud voice, lets out the spirit. Knox says on this scripture, his death was different from all others. He did not linger until life ebbed away, but laid down his soul while still strong by committing his spirit to God. I think that's an interesting statement right there. Laid down his soul while still strong by committing his spirit to God. His body was laid in the tomb. His soul went to the unseen. His work was done, and death was his portion until his resurrection. Really neat commentary on that verse, especially with the backdrop of what we now believe about death. The 37, Mark 15:37, Knox's position here was no man could take his life from him. All the weariness and wounds did not exhaust his vitality. At the very last, he cries out with a loud voice. He laid down his soul of his own will. No mere man could die as he did. Thus it was the Roman centurion recognized his divinity, and thus it is that the alien nations have learned that he is indeed God's son. That's a big statement. I'm still kind of trying to figure out how I feel about
Right.
what Knock's saying here, you know, and how that is. We know that even Knock mentioned he thought things one way and then changed his mind, so that's okay. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, we're putting thoughts out here, and here is from the verse I read, Luke 23:46, and this is the commentary. It says, "The Spirit of the Lord returned to God." Ecclesiastes 12:7 is another reference there. "His soul went to the unseen." It's Acts 2:27 that he has in parentheses there to look at. "But his body was not returned to the soil." It says that his resurrection consisted in the return of his spirit to the body and the consequent return of the consciousness or the soul that come back. So, yeah, that's just interesting to think about what happens and what's going to happen with us. And does our spirit, your spirit, our spirit, Jesus' spirit at death, so go back to the Father, our body, or our soul, our senses,
the sentient part
goes
of
to the
ourself.
unseen, right? It goes to, and what helped me, I started thinking of that, trying to figure that out. Like, what does that mean? And I was like, well, where was I before I become aware?
Yeah.
Right? You're not aware. So it goes to the unseen. It doesn't go to hell. Some of the translations might even put, when it's talking about that, just it goes to this unseen place.
Well, the Greek word Hades means unseen.
Yeah. And some translations will put that word, it will put hell in there.
Yes.
So it can get really...
lumping it again.
Yeah, it gets really confusing. But that's where some of the ideas come. When you die, you either go to heaven or hell.
Yep.
Like you don't really die. You just go on somewhere.
And here what I like is as I began, and I say as God began to show me these truths about death, and then I started looking up evidence, scriptural evidence, and writers that were writing about this, Knock being one of them. Dean just was saying some stuff that Knock says. He simply says that death is a return. Man is soil and returns to the soil. Genesis 3:19. The spirit returns to God who gave it. Ecclesiastes 12:7. And the soul returns to the unseen, whence it came. Psalms 9:17 and Acts 2:27-31. In fact, Job speaks of death itself as a return when he says, "For I know that thou wilt return me to death." Job 30:23. Neither man as a whole nor any part of him enters a new, unknown condition at death. That's interesting. He does not enter a new condition, or an unknown condition, but all returns to the state from which it emerged when life was imparted. Even as the body was created of existing entities, so with the spirit which was given by God, and death, these return to the same condition in which they were before. That is an interesting thing to consider. I really appreciated one of the people that had a really good video on, he touches on these elements. Death was Alan Hess, and it was one of the Birmingham. Maybe we'll find it and attach it or something, possibly. I don't know.
Yeah.
It was a really neat talk, and how he shared with people whose loved ones had died, maybe from an overdose or a suicide, and how Alan could beautifully kind of calm the fears that our religious institutions kind of can create the questions. I said last week we had a wonderful lady in our family who at the very end of her life, who had lived a life you would think as the best Christian she could be, and yet at the very end she's afraid, has she done enough? You know, and that's kind of the other side of the story with this religion's view of death, and that we're going somewhere directly after this. And no longer do I hold to that, but rather what God has shown me through Scripture. Now I'm looking at something else, and there's a lot of material out there too that you can look up. I know on the Concordant there's a great article on what Scripture has to say about death. And it's just one after another about in those days. Clyde says, when people spoke of the dead, they spoke of where their body was.
Yeah.
That's where they are. David sleeps with his fathers. The dead sleep in the dust.
This body without the spirit
returns to its former elements.
It's dead.
It's dead.
And
we have a whole industry.
And that's what we see. With Jesus, he's given. His spirit's going back to the Father.
Yeah. And
that's where your spirit came from. It's going to go back to the Father. There is a thing called resurrection.
Yeah.
That's the beauty in this that we have not experienced yet. And so,
right. And in Scripture, when you start looking at these resurrections, there's all kinds of resurrections. That when he died on the cross, there was a great earthquake, and they said dead people got up and walked back into Jerusalem. People recognized him. They knew who they were. These people were resurrected by Christ dying on the cross. They had to die again. Lazarus was resurrected by Jesus. He had to die again. There are resurrections in which the sea gives up her dead. It's interesting, to part these out, and it gets back to you and I always saying that we need to look at who's speaking, who's the audience, what's the time frame, is Jesus on the earth, not on the earth, is the wall, the barrier up, is it down? So it's been interesting to look at these, consider. I love when Dean says we need to be careful when we try to put ourselves back in this time and then somehow make it apply to us.
Right.
We can confuse ourselves. We can get ourselves off track, distracted by doing that here a little bit and thinking that something said there is directly to me. You may not be to you. There's a lot of Scripture that is not to you. And we borrow confusion when we take a message for someone else and try to apply it to ourselves. That's what I have.
That's all I got there too. So
okay.
Yeah, think about those things, and I love thinking about your last thought there too. Yeah, we read back into these scriptures and try to make it all fit and apply today, and we don't see that it does. But now learning from these, and learning about what the Spirit is, or what death is, learning all these things by studying the past, by studying the Scriptures, it can bring a sense of peace and joy in this world that's full of chaos and full of death and all the troubles we face every day that all humans do.
Yep. Exactly.
We all face these things. So reading these things and learning about them can bring a sense of peace and joy, so that as you was explaining your week, man, you're living. I mean, this is it. Yeah. This is very, very.
I'm right in the middle of it. Yeah.
Everything that's going on it's very important. Every detail, every day has been planned out by God, and there's a reason for it.
Yeah.
So I like that. We'll explore some of that more, because that does trip everybody up when you start reading back into Scripture, like it all applies today.
Well, we've been really forward on these shows about the idea that there's a circumcision gospel and an uncircumcision gospel, and you need to correctly divide the word. What is that, 1 Timothy 2:15 or 2 Timothy 2:15? Correctly dividing the word. We're big on that, and we're big on that because when it was introduced to us, when Father opened our eyes and we began to consider that, some puzzle pieces snapped in. And we were like, oh, wow, that fits now. That didn't contradict here. I'm looking at this message to me that's for me, and this is somebody else's.
Right.
And, oh, that's beautiful. Looks like there's a master craftsman at work.
Yeah.
He knows what he's doing, and it's not on us to try and figure it out. Just go with it. Go with what the Spirit is leading you. That's what Dean and
like
I
that.
talked about upstairs,
Yeah.
about belief.
Yeah.
Is the belief ours? I don't think it is anymore. My belief is faith, and it's being given to me. It's being granted to me, and it's given in little portions here and there, and it just keeps me coming after more.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it for me. Hey,
right.
next week
Well,
we'll talk about I Thirst.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll do it again next week.
Take care.